Today we're kicking off a new sermon series on the book of Deuteronomy called Remember, Trust, and Obey, Living as God's Covenant People. I know. When you think about books of the Bible you love to read, Deuteronomy is probably not very high on your list. But did you know that it was one of Jesus' favorite books? And after the book of Psalms, it was the book he quoted more than any other? I hope by the time we're done with our series, it will be one of your favorite books too. Sadly, even though every Christian acknowledges that Deuteronomy belongs in the Bible, we've largely neglected this book. It's one thing to call a book biblical, but it's another thing to actually treat it that way. And that's what we're going to do in this series. We're going to read it as God's Word for God's people today. Deuteronomy is essentially the heartbeat of the Old Testament, meaning that if you can get the pulse of this book, you'll be well on your way to understanding the whole Old Testament as well as the New. The book of Deuteronomy itself is basically a series of 3 sermons that Moses preached to the people of Israel on the plains of Moab as they were about to enter the Promised Land. They had been wandering around in the wilderness for the last 40 years after God miraculously rescued them from Egypt, and they refused to enter the land the first time they had the opportunity. Now they're on the brink of the land with a second chance. And in these messages, Moses will remind them and us about the promises God made to Abraham, their rescue from Egypt, their failures to trust God in the wilderness, and the giving of His law for their good. As we listen to Moses' words to them, it will be like taking an x-ray of our own hearts, exposing our own fears and failures to trust in the goodness of God. Now, some of you might be wondering, isn't Deuteronomy just full of a bunch of crazy laws? Yes, Deuteronomy does have many laws, some of which are hard to understand. But in the course of our study, we will see just how beneficial a study of these laws are for Christian readers today, even if our relationship to them is different than it was for the people of Israel. Ultimately, the book of Deuteronomy is not primarily about God's laws, but about God's grace. This book was not given to teach us how to become the people of God by living according to the law, but how to live as the people of God who've been graciously rescued from slavery and brought into a relationship with Him. Ultimately, Deuteronomy is a book about love, God's love for His people, and the loving response He desires from His people, to remember what He's done, to trust Him in the present, and to obey Him as we go forward. And as we do this, like Israel, we will become a distinctive people who magnify the goodness and holiness of the one true God in a world desperately in need of a witness. And so, without further ado, let's set off on our next adventure in the Bible together. Remember, trust, and obey, living as God's covenant people.